All right, for our final installment for this series, we're going to be talking about the action and expression guideline when it comes to how to use UDL. So let's review. This is about the strategic network of the brain, illustrated in this drawing of the brain as this blue part that's at the front. And this has to do with the how of learning. Because of how we're all so different in how we learn in that strategic network, the guideline from CAST is to provide multiple means of action and expression. Look at some general ideas when it comes to action and expression. And it's important to talk about how representation was about how you're presenting the content to students. Action and expression has to do with what the students are doing with that content in the way that they're processing and communicating it back to you. So some examples would be, I've got an icon here of a notebook with a pencil to represent writing. Some students process and communicate very clearly in writing. Others struggle with that, so that would be a problem for them. I've got another image here of a person that's got like a bunch of bubbles around them in terms of like a YouTube video and a chart and a graphic and trying to represent their multimedia. The fact that many students, particularly with technology, are able to process and communicate through a variety of methods kind of to convey one message. Think about the way campaigns are run now, right? And way students are plugged into social media. Those kinds of media options can be very helpful for some, but can be baffling for others. Visualization actually should look pretty similar to what we had up in representation, in that some students convey things well through charts, graphs, those kind of visualizations that articulate how information is used. That would include also mind maps and Venn diagrams and other graphic organizers. So we talked about those when we talked about how you're presenting information to them, but it can be another strategy for students to present information back to you, as well as to kind of figure out how to express it themselves. We also have another science experiment. This one just has, one person doing it as opposed to demonstrating it. And that's because hands-on application can be really effective for some students. Maybe they struggle with communicating it verbally or visually, but if you let them, perform it or do it or demonstrate it, that's what allows them to both process more effectively and to be able to communicate what they've learned and with their information that they know. Lastly, I have a person with just a little speech icon because many prefer to verbally explain things. And whether that is something that happens sort of in a synchronous environment, like live in class or in a video conference session, or it's something that they do asynchronously, like recording their voice, that can be a great way for students to be able to convey their information. So all those ideas, again, represent what some strengths and weaknesses might be, because each student is different in that the way they would process these different ways of communicating, expressing, and processing their information. We're getting our playbook back out because we're going to come up with another game plan of how to win out over the obstacles. And so this talks about the strategies that CAST provides. And they say that you should provide options for physical action, for expression and communication, and for executive functions. So let's dive a little deeper into what that means. Pull out that clipboard because we're going to create a little checklist on how to provide options for physical action. And the two strategies listed here are to vary the methods for response and navigation, and to optimize access to tools and assistive technologies. All right, that first one I'll acknowledge tends to be more on the programmer side, but the second one is more something that we can do. Checking off those boxes in the checklist, I'll note again that that first one in terms of options for action has a lot to do with the software programming in terms of allowing people to use keyboards and mice and voice active and things like that. Not something so much that teachers are going to be doing. However, the second one, the example would be to promote assistive technologies when appropriate. Build an awareness of what's out there and then be able to help students connect with the right tools they need. You won't need to buy it or find it or teach them how to use it, but having an awareness means that you can promote it. So consider recommending screen reading tools, screen magnifiers, audiobooks, etc., whenever those things might be helpful for students who are struggling with a barrier to their learning. Let's continue building our little clipboard checklist on how to provide options for expression and communication. So the first strategy here from CAST is to use multiple media for communication. And again, we're talking about really student communication in this situation, because we're talking about how students are able to process and communicate. Let them have multiple media for that. The second strategy, use multiple tools for construction and composition. And this has to do with the fact that different learners, all of us, are different in how we construct and compose, how we put together meaning, how we draft, how we come up with our communication. And so provide tools that allow people to do that in different ways. Our third strategy here is to build fluencies with graduated levels of support for practice and performance. So that has to do with making sure that you're able to give the support and give the options that allow students to improve their communication skills, and eventually hopefully be scaffolded into a better independence with that. Check off some more boxes from that list. One example is to allow both multimedia and text responses. Let students express their thoughts in text, audio recording, or video. And you can do that for discussions, for reflections, for any of those assignments in which the actual format is not what you're assessing, but rather it's sort of the content knowledge. Another example would be to provide optional scaffolds for composition. So for example, you could use sample outlines or sentence starters, but it is important not to mandate those, because you're trying to provide options, not limit students to, hey, you have to build your paper using this format, or you have to build your response starting with this sentence. Provide options so that the scaffolding is there for students who need it and who would like to use it, but doesn't limit students who are coming at it from a different angle. All right, the very last checklist for our clipboard is about providing options for executive functions. So the first strategy here is to guide appropriate goal setting. Help students determine, what goals they should make, and maybe what time frame each one needs, what support they might need for each one. The second strategy is built into that a little bit in support planning and strategy development. A lot of students, due to some differences in the way their executive functions work, aren't necessarily able to break down a project the way that you envision them to. They don't approach it the same way. So you can support their planning and their strategy development by guiding them into different ways to tackle an obstacle, to break down a larger task, to plan ahead for big deadlines, things like that. A third strategy is to facilitate managing information and resources. Again, some students, particularly students with disabilities related to executive functions, can have trouble managing information flow. They can get overwhelmed with sources and information and not be able to organize those or sort them out into useful pieces of information. Lastly, enhance capacity for monitoring and progress. And this sounds a little bit like what we talked about back in engagement when it came to self-regulation, and there is some overlap. But in terms of students being able to track their progress and think through a project or a task, sometimes you need to give them some extra skills or steps to support that. Let's check off just a couple more boxes on that list with our examples. First, you can model and promote resource management tools and strategies. So for example, think about Zotero, Hypothesis, Mendeley, RefWorks, web bookmarking. What are the different ways that you're able to manage the various resources and tools and information that you need to use, and share that with students, model it for them, and promote them to use it their own way as well. Again, don't mandate it. Not everyone should have to do things the same way, but make that exposure happen so they can see ways that it can be done. And the second example here, you can provide optional scaffolds for project management. And this has a lot of different parts. So you can create sample timelines. If they have a large project due, in 8 weeks, what are some, possible timeline of when they could get things done to get it finished by the 8-week point? Encourage scheduled checkpoints. Say, hey, why don't you check in with me in 2 weeks? And at this point, you should hopefully be at this, point of the project, and we can discuss it. Again, we don't want to mandate things. It's about creating options, not necessarily forcing students to do things certain ways. Another part of scaffolding project management can have to do with groups, right? Facilitating group communication. I see this a lot when you give people roles to fill in group. All right, here's your group. You guys have to identify who's going to be the note taker, who's going to be the presenter, who's going to be the person who's in charge of organizing our research, whatever that might be. If you help scaffold that process, that can give them the support structure they need to be able to function more effectively in a group. So those are just a couple examples for being able to really provide options for executive functions. And for the last time, our sources are the National Center on Universal Design for Learning from CAST, and all the icons that we used are from FreePick via flaticon.com.